It was March 15, 1964, the Hollywood Palace television show, ABC Network, live broadcast, 30 million Americans watching. Frank Sinatra stood on that stage like he owned it, because in a very real sense, he did. He was 48 years old and at the absolute peak of his powers. The chairman of the board, Old Blue Eyes, the voice. He'd been a star for over 20 years, survived the Bobby Soxer era, the transition to rock and roll, the rise and fall of his movie career, his comeback. He was untouchable, bulletproof, a living legend. And he was furious. Not the kind of fury that shows on your face. Frank was too professional for that, too smooth, too controlled. But everyone who knew him could see it in his eyes, in the set of his jaw, in the way he held his cigarette. Frank Sinatra was absolutely livid because the Beatles were everywhere. Everywhere. You couldn't turn on a radio without hearing them. You couldn't open a newspaper without seeing their faces. You couldn't walk down a street without hearing teenage girls screaming about Paul or John or George or Ringo. They'd arrived in America 6 weeks earlier and had essentially conquered the country overnight. Ed Sullivan, Carnegie Hall. The whole nation had lost its mind, and Frank hated it. Not because he was jealous. At least that's what he told himself. He was Frank Sinatra. He didn't get jealous of mop-top kids from Liverpool who couldn't even read music. He hated it because it represented everything he thought was wrong with modern music. No craftsmanship, no sophistication, no respect for the great American songbook. Just noise and screaming and teenage hysteria. The Hollywood Palace had booked him to host that night. It was a variety show, different acts, comedy sketches, musical performances. Frank was supposed to introduce the acts, tell some jokes, maybe sing a song or two. Standard television work, easy money. But during rehearsal that afternoon, something had happened that pushed Frank over the edge. The producers had shown him the lineup, the other acts performing that night, and there, scheduled for the second half of the show, was a musical act called The Rolling Stones. Frank had looked at the producer like he'd lost his mind. The Rolling Stones? Are you kidding me? The producer had smiled nervously. They're very popular right now, Frank. The kids love them. The kids love a lot of things that are terrible for them, Frank had shot back. That doesn't mean we have to put them on television. But the producer had insisted. The Stones were booked, contract signed. They were performing whether Frank liked it or not. Frank had agreed, barely. But he'd made it clear that if he had to introduce these long-haired British kids, he was going to say exactly what he thought about them. And about the Beatles. And about this whole British invasion nonsense that was ruining American music. The producer had tried to talk him out of it. Frank, the Beatles are the biggest thing in the world right now. You can't just insult them on national television. Frank had looked at him with those ice blue eyes. Watch me. And so, at 8:47 p.m. Eastern Time, in front of 30 million viewers, Frank Sinatra stood at the microphone and said the words that would change everything. You know, we've got a lot of acts on the show tonight. Some good, some not so good. And speaking of not so good, let me tell you something about this British invasion everyone keeps talking about. He paused, took a drag from his cigarette. Let the audience lean in. These Beatles, these Rolling Stones, these long-haired kids who can't play their instruments and can't carry a tune. They're not musicians. They're a gimmick, a fad. And like all fads, they'll be gone in 6 months. Meanwhile, real music, the kind that requires talent and training and respect for the craft, that music will still be here because quality lasts. And these kids, they're not quality, they're noise. The studio audience was silent, shocked. This wasn't playful ribbing. This wasn't good-natured teasing. This was Frank Sinatra, one of the most powerful men in entertainment, declaring war on the biggest phenomenon in music. Back in New York, in a hotel room at the Plaza, 4 Beatles were watching. They'd been in America for 6 weeks. They were exhausted. They'd done more television and radio and press conferences than they could count. They were scheduled to fly back to London the next day. This was supposed to be their last night in America, a chance to relax, to watch some television, to decompress. John Lennon was sprawled on one bed. Paul McCartney sat in a chair by the window. George Harrison was on the floor, guitar in his lap. quietly strumming. Ringo Starr was in the bathroom, but he'd left the door open so he could hear the TV. When Frank Sinatra made his statement, the room went silent. Paul looked at John. Did he just say we're not musicians? John's face was unreadable. He did. George stopped playing. He called us a gimmick. Ringo came out of the bathroom. He said we'd be gone in 6 months. They all looked at each other, waiting, wondering. How were they supposed to respond to this? Frank Sinatra was an icon, a legend, the biggest solo star in American music, and he just publicly destroyed them on national television. The phone in the hotel room rang. Paul answered it. It was Brian Epstein, their manager. He'd been watching in his own room down the hall. His voice was tight with controlled anger. Did you boys see that? We saw it, Paul said. I'm calling ABC right now. This is unacceptable. Frank Sinatra doesn't get to insult you on national television without consequences. Brian, wait, John said, loud enough for Brian to hear through the phone. Don't call anyone. Paul relayed the message. Brian's voice came back confused. What do you mean, don't call anyone? John, he just called you a fad. He said you're not musicians. We can't let that stand. John stood up, walked over to Paul, took the phone. Brian, listen to me. If we make a big deal out of this, we look defensive. We look small, like we're threatened by Frank Sinatra's opinion. But we're not threatened. We don't need to be. So here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow, before we fly home, I'm going to give a press conference. And I'm going to respond. But we're not going to be angry. We're not going to be defensive. We're going to be smart. There was a long pause, then Brian's voice, quieter now. What are you going to say? John smiled. You'll see. The next morning, March 16th, 1964, the Plaza Hotel. Press conference. Every major newspaper, radio station, and television network in New York was there. They'd all seen the Hollywood Palace the night before. They all knew about Frank's comments. They were expecting blood, a feud, the Beatles firing back at Sinatra, entertainment gold. John Lennon walked into that room like he didn't have a care in the world. Cigarette in his mouth, sunglasses on, that Lennon smirk playing at the corners of his lips. Paul, George, and Ringo flanked him. All 4 Beatles looked relaxed, amused even. The reporters started shouting questions immediately. John, what do you think about Frank Sinatra's comments? Are you upset? Do you have a response? John held up his hand. The room went quiet. He took off his sunglasses, looked directly at the cameras, and said in that sharp Liverpool accent, Frank Sinatra called us a gimmick, said we can't play our instruments, said we're not real musicians. He paused. Let it hang there. And you know what? He's absolutely right. The room erupted, reporters shouting, cameras flashing, chaos. John waited for them to quiet down. Then he continued. We are a gimmick. 4 lads from Liverpool with matching haircuts and matching suits. That's a gimmick. Frank's right about that. And can we play our instruments? Well, we haven't had decades of training like Frank has. We're self-taught. We learned in sweaty clubs in Hamburg and Liverpool. So by his standards, maybe we can't play. He's not wrong. The reporters were scribbling furiously. This wasn't what they'd expected. This wasn't a fight. This was something else. But here's the thing, John continued, and now his voice got quieter, more serious. Frank Sinatra is one of the greatest singers who ever lived. Nobody's arguing that. The man's a legend. He's been doing this for decades. He's got a voice that could make angels weep, and we respect that. We respect him. I grew up listening to Frank Sinatra. My mom loved him, so I know what real talent sounds like. I know what real musicianship is. He paused, lit a cigarette, took a drag. But you know what Frank doesn't understand? Music changes. It evolves. What was revolutionary in his day isn't revolutionary now. That doesn't make his music bad. It just makes it different. And what we're doing, what we're part of, this is the new thing. This is what young people want. Not because they're stupid, not because they don't appreciate quality, but because they want something that speaks to them, to their lives, to their world. Frank's music spoke to his generation. Our music speaks to ours. That's not a competition. That's just how music works. The room was silent now, everyone listening. John looked directly at the camera, directly at America. directly at Frank. So Frank, if you're watching, here's what I want to say. You're right. We're a gimmick. We're a fad. Maybe we will be gone in 6 months. Time will tell. But right now, in this moment, we're what people want. And if that bothers you, I'm sorry. But it doesn't change the fact that we respect you. We respect your music. We respect what you've accomplished. And we hope that someday, maybe you'll listen to our music with an open mind. Not as a threat, not as competition, but as something new, something different, something that came after you. Because that's what we are. We're what came after Frank Sinatra. And that's not an insult to him. That's a compliment, because it means he was important enough that there had to be something after him. John put his sunglasses back on. Any other questions? Within an hour, John's response was on every radio station in America. By evening, it was headline news. Beatles respond to Sinatra with class. John Lennon's graceful response to Frank's insults. Beatles take the high road. Frank Sinatra heard about it while having lunch at Chasen's restaurant in Beverly Hills. Someone showed him a newspaper. He read John's words, read them twice. Then he put the paper down, lit a cigarette, and said quietly, "That kid's smarter than I gave him credit for." That night, Frank couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about what John had said. We're what came after Frank Sinatra. And that's not an insult to him. That's a compliment. Frank had expected anger, defensiveness, insults thrown back at him. But instead, John had responded with intelligence, with respect, with an understanding of music history that Frank hadn't expected from a 23-year-old kid from Liverpool. Frank started thinking about his own career, how he'd come up in the big band era, how he'd broken away and become a solo artist, how the older generation had said he was ruining music, how they'd called him a fad, a gimmick, a pretty face with a mediocre voice, and how he'd proved them all wrong, not by fighting them, but by being so good they couldn't ignore him. And now he was the older generation, and he was doing exactly what had been done to him, dismissing something new because it wasn't what he knew, because it scared him, because it meant his time at the top might be coming to an end. The next day, March 17th, Frank Sinatra called his publicist. "Get me a number for the Beatles manager." "What's his name?" "Epstein? Brian Epstein. Get me his number." By evening, Frank had Brian Epstein's phone number. He called the London office. Brian answered. Frank identified himself. There was a long pause. "Mr. Sinatra, this is unexpected." Frank got straight to the point. "I saw John Lennon's press conference, and I want to talk to him. Can you arrange that?" Another pause. "May I ask what this is about?" "I want to apologize." Within 2 hours, Frank Sinatra was on the phone with John Lennon. The conversation lasted 45 minutes. Years later, John described it in interviews. "Frank called me. I couldn't believe it." Frank Sinatra on the phone. And the first thing he said was, "Kid, I was wrong. I said some things on television that I shouldn't have said. And you responded with more class than I showed. So I'm calling to tell you, I'm sorry." John had been shocked, speechless. Frank Sinatra calling to apologize. "I didn't know what to say, so I just said, 'Mr. Sinatra, you don't have to apologize. You have a right to your opinion.' And he said, 'Call me Frank.' And yeah, I have a right to my opinion, but my opinion was wrong. Or at least, it was unfair. I listened to some of your music, really listened. And you know what? You're good, really good. You're doing something different from what I do. But different doesn't mean bad. It just means different. And I was scared. Scared that what you're doing means what I'm doing doesn't matter anymore. But your response made me realize something. We're not competing. We're both part of the same story. I'm one chapter, you're the next chapter. And that's how it's supposed to work." John had told him, "Frank, your chapter's not over. You're still Frank Sinatra. You'll always be Frank Sinatra. Nothing we do changes that." And Frank had replied, "Maybe, but the world's moving on, and I need to move with it, or at least understand it. So here's what I'm proposing. When you boys come back to America, come to Vegas. Come see my show, be my guests. And after, we'll have dinner, just us, and we'll talk about music, about what you're doing, about where this is all going, because I want to understand and I want to learn from you." 6 months later, August 1964, the Beatles were back in America. Las Vegas. Frank Sinatra's show at the Sands Hotel. Frank had reserved a private booth for them, best seats in the house. He performed his full set, 90 minutes, every song perfect. The audience mesmerized. After the show, backstage, Frank met the Beatles, all four of them, face to face for the first time. Frank shook their hands, looked at John. "Thank you for coming." John smiled. "Thank you for inviting us. That was incredible. You're even better in person than on record." They had dinner, just the five of them. Frank ordered wine. They talked for 3 hours. About music, about fame, about pressure, about what it means to be at the top, about what it means when you're not at the top anymore. Frank told stories about Ava Gardner, about JFK, about the Rat Pack. The Beatles told stories about Hamburg, about the Cavern, about the madness of Beatlemania. At one point, Frank raised his glass. "To the new generation, may you last longer than 6 months." John raised his glass. "To the old generation, for showing us how it's done." They remained friends after that. Not close friends. They lived in different worlds. But friends, mutual respect. Frank would occasionally call John when the Beatles released a new album. Ask what John was trying to do with a particular song. Why they'd made certain choices. John would send Frank early pressings of albums before they were released. Ask for his opinion. When the Beatles broke up in 1970, Frank called John. "I heard the news, I'm sorry, kid." John had sighed. "Yeah, me too. But all things must pass, right? That's what George says." "You'll do fine solo," Frank said. "You're too talented not to." Coming from you, that means something. When John was murdered in 1980, Frank Sinatra was performing at Carnegie Hall. Someone told him between sets. Frank went quiet. Then he walked back on stage and said, "I just heard that John Lennon was killed tonight in New York. John was a friend. He was brilliant. He was important. And the world is worse without him." Then Frank sang "In My Life," the Beatles song, his voice breaking in places, tears in his eyes, his tribute to John Lennon. That's the story people don't know. Frank Sinatra and John Lennon, the old guard and the new, the legend and the revolutionary. They could have been enemies. They should have been enemies. Everything about their situation suggested they'd hate each other forever. But instead, they became friends. Because John responded to insults with intelligence. Because Frank was big enough to admit when he was wrong. Because both of them understood that music wasn't a competition. It was a conversation. Across generations. Across styles. Across everything. Frank Sinatra died in 1998. Paul McCartney spoke at a memorial. "Frank taught me something important. He taught me that you can be at the top of the world and still be humble enough to say, 'I was wrong.' That's real power. That's real class. And I'll never forget it." The lesson is simple. Respect doesn't come from tearing others down. It comes from lifting them up, from admitting mistakes, from being big enough to change your mind. Frank Sinatra was one of the greatest singers who ever lived. But his greatest moment might have been the day he picked up the phone and called John Lennon to apologize. Because that's when Frank Sinatra showed the world what real greatness looks like. Not the voice, not the swagger, but the humility, the willingness to learn, the courage to say, "I was wrong." That's the kind of greatness that lasts. That's the kind of greatness that matters. That's Frank Sinatra, that's John Lennon, that's music, that's respect, that's everything.